Let us begin in the dim light of the 17th century. It is a world that would seem in many ways quite foreign to us now. A world where kings ruled by what they called divine right, where the structure of society was believed to be ordained by God himself, fixed and eternal as the stars in the heavens. Imagine, if you will, the Europe of the 1600s. It is a continent emerging slowly from the long shadow of the medieval period. The great cathedrals still dominate the skylines of cities. The church bells still mark the rhythm of daily life, and the authority of the church remains, in most places, absolute in matters of faith, morality, and even in matters of truth itself. But something is beginning to change. In the courts of Europe, monarchs sit upon their gilded thrones, claiming their authority comes directly from God. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, will famously declare, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state. It is not a boast precisely. It is, to him and to many of his subjects, simply a statement of fact. The king is the living embodiment of the nation, and his will is law. This system, which historians call absolutism, rests on several interlocking ideas. First, that political power flows downward from God, through the monarch, to the nobility, and finally to the common people. Second, that this hierarchy is natural, proper, and unchangeable. And third, that to question this order is not merely political dissent. It is a form of blasphemy, a rebellion against the divine plan itself. In England, the situation is somewhat different, though not entirely so. The English had executed their king, Charles I, in 1649, a shocking act that reverberated throughout Europe. But after a period of republican rule under Oliver Cromwell, the monarchy was restored in 1660. The question of where ultimate authority resided, between king and parliament, between crown and law, remained unsettled, a tension that would have profound consequences. Now, let us consider the intellectual world of this period. For most people, education was rare, literacy limited. Books were expensive, laboriously copied or printed one at a time. The vast majority of Europeans lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Their worldview shaped almost entirely by their local priest or minister, by inherited tradition, by the unchanging cycle of the agricultural seasons. But among the educated classes, among those who could read Latin and had access to libraries, a different kind of conversation was taking place. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of Western Christianity. Europe was still recovering from the devastating 30 Years' War, which had raged from 1618 to 1648, killing millions and leaving entire regions depopulated. That war, fought largely over religion, had ended not with the triumph of one faith over another, but with a kind of exhausted stalemate. And this exhaustion, this weariness with religious conflict, would prove to be one of the seeds from which the Enlightenment would grow. At the same time, as if thinking aloud, something remarkable was happening in the realm of natural philosophy, what we would today call science. In 1543, the Polish astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus had published his revolutionary work proposing that the Earth moved around the Sun, not the other way around. This heliocentric model contradicted both common sense and church teaching, which held that the Earth stood fixed at the center of God's creation. For decades, this remained largely a mathematical curiosity, a way of calculating planetary positions. But then came Galileo Galilei. In the early 1600s, Galileo turned his newly improved telescope toward the heavens and saw things that no human eye had ever witnessed. He saw mountains on the moon, spots on the sun, and 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. a miniature solar system that demonstrated, quite clearly, that not everything in the cosmos revolved around the Earth. Galileo wrote about his discoveries in Italian, not Latin, making his ideas accessible to a broader audience. He argued for the Copernican system with wit and vigor, and for this, he was eventually tried by the Roman Inquisition and forced to recant his views, spending the last years of his life under house arrest. But the ideas could not be imprisoned. The scientific revolution continued to gather momentum. In England, Francis Bacon had proposed a new method for understanding nature, not through abstract reasoning alone, but through careful observation and experiment. René Descartes, the French philosopher and mathematician, famously declared, "Cogito, ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. In his Discourse on Method, published in 1637, Descartes proposed systematic doubt as a path to certainty, doubting everything that could possibly be doubted, until he arrived at something indubitable, the fact of his own thinking existence. This emphasis on individual reason, on the power of the human mind to discover truth through its own efforts, would become central to the Enlightenment project. And then came Isaac Newton. In 1687, Newton published his Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, usually known simply as the Principia. In this monumental work, Newton demonstrated that the same mathematical laws governed both the falling of an apple and the orbits of the planets. The force of gravity, he showed, operated throughout the universe according to precise, invariable mathematical principles. The implications were staggering. If the cosmos itself operated according to rational, discoverable laws, if the universe was, in essence, a kind of vast machine, wound up and set running by God, but thereafter operating according to its own internal logic, then perhaps other realms of existence might also be understood through reason. Perhaps society, politics, morality itself might be illuminated by the light of rational inquiry. The universe Newton described, gently, was orderly, predictable, knowable. It was a universe that could be understood through mathematics and observation, not through appeals to ancient authority or divine revelation. And this new vision of a rational, law-governed cosmos provided a model, a template, for how Enlightenment thinkers would approach questions of human society and government. But we must be careful here. The scientific revolution did not immediately produce the Enlightenment. Most of the great scientists of the 17th century remained deeply religious. Newton himself spent more time studying theology and biblical prophecy than he did on physics. They saw themselves not as replacing God with reason, but as discovering the rational principles by which God had ordered his creation. Nevertheless, as if thinking aloud, the effect was revolutionary. If one could question Aristotle's physics, which had stood for nearly 2,000 years, if one could challenge the Church's astronomical teachings, what else might be questioned? What other received truths might turn out to be errors, waiting to be corrected by careful reason and observation? In the coffee houses of London and Amsterdam, in the salons of Paris, in letters exchanged between scholars across Europe, a new kind of intellectual culture was emerging. People began to speak of a republic of letters, a community of scholars and thinkers bound not by national loyalty or religious affiliation, but by their shared commitment to rational inquiry and the pursuit of knowledge. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, was making books cheaper and more available. Literacy rates were slowly rising, particularly among the urban middle classes. Newspapers began to appear, carrying not just official proclamations, but news, commentary, and debate. Information was beginning to flow more freely than ever before in human history. And yet, for all these changes, Europe in the late 1600s remained, in most respects, a traditional society. Monarchies still dominated. The church still held immense power. Censorship was common. Books could be banned, authors imprisoned or exiled. To express certain ideas could be dangerous, even fatal. The Enlightenment, when it came, would not be a sudden revolution. It would be a gradual awakening, a slow brightening of the intellectual horizon. It would be carried forward by individuals, philosophers, writers, scientists, who dared to ask new questions and to insist that reason, not tradition or authority, should be the final judge of truth. Let us turn now, gently, to one of the first and most influential of these thinkers, an Englishman who would lay the philosophical foundation for much of Enlightenment thought. His name was John Locke, and his ideas about government, human understanding, and religious tolerance would help to shape the modern world. But to understand Locke, we must first understand the England into which he was born, and the political crisis that would force him into exile, and, paradoxically, make his philosophy possible. John Locke was born in 1632 in the small village of Rington in Somerset, England. His father was a country lawyer and small landowner, comfortable but not wealthy. Locke grew up during one of the most turbulent periods in English history, the Civil War that would end with the execution of King Charles I and the brief establishment of a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Young Locke received an excellent education. He attended Westminster School in London and from there went to Christ Church, Oxford, one of England's ancient universities. At Oxford, he studied the traditional curriculum, logic, metaphysics, classical languages. But Locke found much of this scholastic philosophy dry and unsatisfying. He was much more interested in the new, experimental science being practiced by members of the Royal Society, particularly the work of Robert Boyle, the pioneering chemist. Locke studied medicine, though he never formally qualified as a physician. This medical training, with its emphasis on careful observation and practical application, would influence his philosophical thinking in important ways. He came to believe that knowledge should be useful, that it should help us navigate the actual world we inhabit, not just provide abstract speculations. In 1666, Locke's life took a decisive turn. He met Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, one of the most important politicians in Restoration England. Shaftesbury was impressed by Locke's intellect and employed him as a personal physician and advisor. Through Shaftesbury, Locke entered the world of politics at the highest levels. This was a dangerous world. England's political situation remained unstable. Charles II had been restored to the throne in 1660, but tensions between the monarchy and Parliament persisted. Questions about succession, about religious policy, about the limits of royal power, these issues dominated political life and could land one in the Tower of London, or worse. Shaftesbury was a leader of what became known as the Whig Party, which opposed the idea of absolute monarchy and feared the succession of Charles's brother James, who was openly Catholic in a still predominantly Protestant nation. Shaftesbury and his allies wanted to exclude James from the throne, and they were prepared to go to considerable lengths to achieve this goal. Locke was deeply involved in these political struggles. In the early 1680s, as Shaftesbury's fortunes declined and he fled into exile in Holland, Locke found himself in increasing danger. There were rumours of conspiracies, plots to assassinate the king. Whether Locke was directly involved remains unclear, but he certainly knew many who were. In 1683, Locke himself fled to Holland, where he would remain for 5 years, living sometimes under false names, always wary of English agents who might arrest him and bring him back to face trial for treason. It was during these years of exile that Locke completed his most important philosophical works, though they would not be published until after his safe return to England. And to understand these works, we must first understand the intellectual problem Locke was trying to solve. The question, as if thinking aloud, put simply, was this: by what right does anyone, king, parliament, or people, claim to exercise political power over others? The traditional answer, the one that supported absolute monarchy, was that political authority came from God. Kings ruled by divine right, and subjects owed them obedience as a religious duty. But Locke rejected this view entirely. In his two treatises of government, written largely in the 1680s, but published only in 1689, Locke laid out a radically different theory of political legitimacy. The first treatise is largely forgotten today. It was a detailed refutation of a book by Sir Robert Filmer, which argued that royal authority descended directly from the authority God gave to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Locke systematically demolished this argument, showing it to be both philosophically incoherent and unsupported by scripture. But it is the second treatise that contains Locke's positive theory, his own answer to the question of political authority. And this answer begins, remarkably, not with kings or governments, but with individual human beings in what Locke called the state of nature. Imagine, Locke asks us, human beings before any government exists. What would such a condition be like? It would not, Locke insists, be a state of chaos or constant war. Human beings, even in the state of nature, possess reason. And reason teaches us a fundamental moral law, what Locke calls the law of nature. This law of nature, which Locke believed could be discovered by reason alone, tells us that all human beings are fundamentally equal. No one is naturally subject to anyone else, and from this equality flows certain natural rights. Rights we possess simply by virtue of being human, not rights granted by any government or king. What are these rights? Locke identifies three as fundamental: life, liberty, and property. Every person has a right to preserve their own life, to live freely without being subject to the arbitrary will of another, and to own property, which for Locke includes not just physical possessions, but one's own body and the fruits of one's labor. In the state of nature, each person has the right to enforce these natural laws, to protect themselves, and to seek compensation or punishment when others violate natural law. But this system, Locke recognizes, has serious problems. When individuals judge their own cases, they tend to be partial. When individuals enforce the law themselves, the strong can oppress the weak. Disputes escalate. Life becomes uncertain and insecure. And so, rational individuals agree to leave the state of nature and form a civil society, a government. But here is the crucial point. This government is created by an agreement, a social contract among the people. Political authority does not descend from above, from God to the king. It ascends from below, from the consent of the governed. The purpose of government, in Locke's view, is to protect natural rights more effectively than individuals could protect them in the state of nature. Government is a tool created by the people for their benefit. And if a government fails in this purpose, if it violates the natural rights it was created to protect, if it rules not by law but by arbitrary power, then the people have the right to alter or abolish it. This was, in the context of the late 17th century, a revolutionary claim. Locke was arguing that legitimate government rests on consent, that there are limits to what any government can rightfully do, and that people have a right to resist tyranny. These ideas would echo down through the centuries, finding expression in the American Declaration of Independence, in the French Revolution, in democratic movements around the world. But Locke's influence extended beyond political philosophy. He was also one of the founders of modern empiricism, the view that all knowledge ultimately derives from experience. In 1689, The same year the two treatises were published, Locke also published his essay concerning human understanding, a massive work he had been labouring over for nearly 20 years. The essay asks a fundamental question: how do we acquire knowledge? What are the origins and limits of human understanding? Locke's answer begins with a rejection of innate ideas, the notion, common in earlier philosophy, that certain truths or concepts are stamped on the mind from birth. Locke argues instead that the human mind begins as a tabula rasa, a blank slate. At birth, we know nothing. All our ideas, all our knowledge, comes from experience. Experience, for Locke, has two sources. The first is sensation, the information we receive through our five senses about the external world. We see colours, hear sounds, feel textures. These sensory experiences give us simple ideas. The second source is reflection, the mind's observation of its own operations. We are aware of ourselves thinking, doubting, believing, willing. This too gives us ideas. From these simple ideas, the mind constructs more complex ones through processes of combination, comparison, and abstraction. In this way, starting from the raw material of sensory experience, we build up our entire conceptual apparatus, our understanding of the world. This may sound like common sense to us now, but in Locke's time, it was controversial. If all knowledge comes from experience, then we are, in an important sense, products of our environment and education. Change the experiences a child has, and you change the ideas and beliefs they will form. This made education crucially important, and it undermined claims that certain social hierarchies or political arrangements were natural and inevitable. Locke was also deeply concerned with questions of religious tolerance, a pressing issue in an age torn by religious conflict. In his letter concerning toleration, first published in Latin in 1689, Locke argued that religious belief could not and should not be imposed by force. The state's proper domain was the protection of life, liberty, and property, not the salvation of souls. Different religious groups should be free to practice their faith as they saw fit, so long as they did not threaten civil peace or violate the rights of others. The magistrate had no authority to prescribe articles of faith or forms of worship. Religion was a matter between the individual and God, not between the subject and the state. There were limits to Locke's tolerance, it must be said. He did not extend it to Catholics, whom he saw as owing allegiance to a foreign power, the Pope. He did not extend it to atheists, whom he believed could not be trusted to keep their oaths. By our standards, his tolerance was incomplete, but in the context of the 17th century, when religious uniformity was seen as essential to political stability, Locke's argument for even limited toleration was radical. In 1688, while Locke was still in exile in Holland, England underwent what came to be called the Glorious Revolution. The Catholic King James II, whose policies had alienated both Whigs and Tories, was deposed. His Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange were invited to take the throne, but under conditions set by Parliament. The monarchy would be constitutional, limited by law. Parliament's supremacy in certain key areas, particularly taxation, was established. A Bill of Rights protected certain liberties. Locke returned to England in 1689, sailing on the same ship as the new Queen Mary. His major works were published in quick succession. Though published anonymously at first, they were widely read and debated. Locke spent his remaining years in semi-retirement at the home of friends in Essex, continuing to write on topics ranging from economics to education to biblical interpretation. He died in 1704 at the age of 72, while his friend, Lady Massam, read the Psalms to him. His tomb bears a modest inscription, but his intellectual legacy was already secured. Locke had provided a philosophical foundation for constitutional government, for religious tolerance, for empirical science. His ideas about natural rights and government by consent would inspire revolutionaries in America and France in the next century. But Locke was not alone. The Enlightenment was a collective enterprise, carried forward by hundreds of thinkers across Europe. And nowhere was the Enlightenment spirit expressed with more wit, more verve, more caustic brilliance than in the work of a French writer who would adopt a pen name that became synonymous with the age itself. His birth name was François-Marie Arouet, but history knows him as Voltaire, and to his story we now turn. François-Marie Arouet was born in Paris in 1694 into a world very different from Locke's England. France, under Louis XIV, was the most powerful nation in Europe, and its government was the very model of absolute monarchy. The Sun King ruled with unchallenged authority. He had famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi," and he meant it. The French nobility lived in gilded splendor at Versailles, dancing attendance on the king, while the common people labored under heavy taxation and had no voice in how they were governed. Young François-Marie was the youngest of 5 children. His father was a prosperous notary, a member of the Parisian bourgeoisie. The family had money, but not noble title, a distinction that mattered enormously in the rigid social hierarchy of old regime France. From an early age, the boy showed a brilliant, restless intelligence and a gift for words that was little short of genius. He was educated at the Collège Louis le Grand, a Jesuit school that provided an excellent classical education. There he learned Latin, studied rhetoric, read the ancient philosophers and poets. The Jesuits recognized his talents, even as they worried about his irreverent streak. He was, even as a youth, inclined to question, to mock, to push against boundaries. In his 20s, Arouet began to make a name for himself as a poet and playwright. He wrote verses that circulated in the salons of Paris, those gatherings where the intellectual and social elite met to converse, to debate ideas, to display their wit. Some of his verses were witty and charming. Others were sharp and satirical, mocking the powerful. This proved dangerous. In 1717, at the age of 22, Arouet was arrested and imprisoned in the Bastille, accused of writing satirical poems about the regent, the Duc d'Orléans, who ruled France during the minority of Louis XV. He was held for nearly a year in that grim fortress, in a cell with little light and less comfort. But Arouet did not waste his time there. He wrote. He worked on an epic poem, the Henriade, about Henry IV of France, the king who had ended the wars of religion and granted toleration to Protestants. It was in the Bastille that François-Marie Arouet adopted the pen name by which history would know him, Voltaire. The origin of this name is uncertain. It may be an anagram of Arouet L.J., Arouet le Jeune, Arouet the Younger, or it may have been chosen simply for its sound, its flair. In any case, when he emerged from the Bastille in 1718, he emerged as Voltaire. And Voltaire would soon become one of the most famous writers in Europe. His tragedies were performed at the Comédie Française to great acclaim. His Henriade was published and dedicated to the young Queen of England, earning him both fame and fortune. Voltaire moved in the highest circles of Parisian society. He was clever, charming, ambitious, but he was also increasingly willing to speak dangerous truths. In 1726, Voltaire had a confrontation with a young nobleman, the Chevalier de Rohan. The details are disputed, but it seems that Rohan insulted Voltaire, perhaps mocking his bourgeois origins. Voltaire responded with a witty comeback. A few days later, Rohan had his servants beat Voltaire with sticks while Rohan watched. When Voltaire tried to challenge Rohan to a duel, seeking satisfaction as a gentleman would, he was mocked and then arrested. The message was clear. No matter how famous or clever Voltaire might be, he was not noble. He did not have the rights and privileges of a gentleman. He could be beaten with impunity. And when he tried to demand justice, he himself was punished. This incident crystallized something in Voltaire. He was released from prison on condition that he leave France. In May of 1726, he crossed the English Channel and went into exile in England, where he would remain for nearly 3 years. It was, perhaps, the most important journey of his life. In England, Voltaire discovered a society that, while far from perfect, was freer and more tolerant than France. England had a constitutional monarchy, with real power in Parliament. It had habeas corpus, which meant one could not be imprisoned indefinitely without trial. It had a relatively free press. Books and pamphlets debated political and religious questions with a freedom that would have been impossible in France. Voltaire learned English and read voraciously. He attended sessions of Parliament. He visited the Royal Society and met leading scientists and philosophers. He read Locke and Newton. He attended Quaker meetings, fascinated by these radical Protestants who rejected all hierarchy, who believed that every person could communicate directly with God, who refused to remove their hats even in the presence of kings. And he took notes. Careful, detailed notes on everything he observed. English politics, English philosophy, English science, English religious diversity, all of it fascinated him, particularly the contrast with France. When Voltaire finally returned to France in 1729, he brought these observations with him. Over the next few years, he worked them into a book, the Lettres philosophiques, or philosophical letters, also known as the Letters Concerning the English Nation. Published in 1734, it was a bombshell. The book takes the form of a series of letters describing various aspects of English life. There are letters on the Quakers, on the Church of England, on Parliament, on commerce, on inoculation against smallpox. There are letters on Locke's philosophy and Newton's physics. The tone is light, witty, conversational. Voltaire praises English freedoms and English tolerance, but the real effect of the book is in what it implies about France. The praise of England is implicitly a criticism of France. When Voltaire marvels that in England a man of merit can rise to prominence regardless of his birth, the reader thinks of France's rigid class hierarchy. When he praises England's religious toleration, the reader thinks of the persecution of French Protestants. When he describes Parliament's power, the reader thinks of France's absolute monarchy. The authorities understood this perfectly well. The book was condemned. Copies were seized and burned. A warrant was issued for Voltaire's arrest. Once again, he was forced to flee Paris. He took refuge at Cirey, a chateau in eastern France owned by his lover, Émilie du Châtelet. The Marquise du Châtelet was herself a remarkable woman, a mathematician and physicist of considerable ability, who would translate Newton's Principia into French, still the standard French translation. At Cirey, Voltaire and Émilie created a kind of intellectual retreat. They set up a laboratory for scientific experiments. They read, they studied, they wrote. Voltaire continued to produce an astonishing volume of work: plays, poems, histories, philosophical tales. He corresponded with intellectuals across Europe. His fame grew. By the 1740s, he was arguably the most celebrated writer in Europe. But his relationship with authority remained complicated. For a time, he was in favour at the court of Louis XV, even appointed official historiographer. But a careless remark at a card table offended the king's mistress, and Voltaire was once again in danger. He accepted an invitation from Frederick II, of Prussia, the so-called philosopher king, who professed to admire Enlightenment ideas. Voltaire spent 3 years, from 1750 to 1753, at Frederick's court in Potsdam. At first, all seemed well. Frederick and Voltaire engaged in brilliant conversations, debated philosophy, collaborated on texts. But the two men were too similar in some ways, too different in others. Both were vain, both quick to take offense. Quarrels developed. Frederick, for all his philosophical pretensions, was still an absolute monarch, and he expected deference. The final break came over a financial dispute. Voltaire, always astute about money, had engaged in some rather shady financial dealings. Frederick was furious. Voltaire prepared to leave Prussia, but Frederick had him arrested at the border and held for several weeks. A humiliating reminder that even the most famous writer in Europe was subject to the power of princes. By the mid-1750s, Voltaire was in his 60s, wealthy but essentially homeless. Unwelcome in Paris, unwilling to return to Frederick's Prussia, he finally settled at Ferney, a small estate right on the Swiss border, where he could flee across the frontier at a moment's notice if the French authorities moved against him. Ferney would be his home for the last 20 years of his life, and from this remote corner of France, he would wage his most sustained campaign yet against what he called l'infâme, infamy, by which he meant religious intolerance, injustice, superstition, and persecution. Voltaire had long been critical of organized religion, particularly the Catholic Church. He was not an atheist. He believed in God, or at least in a creator who had set the universe in motion according to rational laws. But he had no patience for dogma, for miracles, for claims of special revelation. He saw the Church as a source of obscurantism and oppression, using fear and superstition to maintain its power. And in the 1760s, several cases of injustice came to his attention that seemed to perfectly exemplify the evils he opposed. The most famous was the case of Jean Calas, a Protestant merchant in Toulouse. In 1761, Calas's eldest son was found dead, apparently by suicide. But in Toulouse, a city with a history of religious tension, rumors spread that the father had murdered his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. Jean Calas was arrested, tried, and condemned. Despite maintaining his innocence, despite the lack of credible evidence, he was tortured and then executed by being broken on the wheel, one of the most agonizing methods of execution. His property was confiscated, his family destroyed. When Voltaire learned of this case, he was outraged. He investigated, gathered testimony, and became convinced that Calas was innocent, the victim of religious fanaticism and judicial murder. He began a campaign to clear Calas's name, writing pamphlets, mobilizing public opinion, pressuring the authorities. It took 3 years, but Voltaire succeeded. In 1765, the King's Council overturned the conviction. Jean Calas was officially exonerated, though of course this came too late for Calas himself. It was a remarkable victory for justice and for the power of public opinion mobilized by an intellectual campaign. Voltaire took up other cases as well. The case of Cervin, another Protestant falsely accused. The case of the Chevalier de la Barre, a young man tortured and executed for acts of blasphemy. In each case, Voltaire used his fame, his pen, his networks to fight against injustice. His rallying cry was "Écrasez l'infâme," crush infamy. But Voltaire's campaign was not just reactive. He also produced a flood of positive work, histories, philosophical works, and above all, contes philosophiques, philosophical tales that used fiction to convey Enlightenment ideas. The most famous of these tales is Candide, published in 1759. It purports to be a translation of a manuscript by a certain Dr. Ralph, though everyone knew it was Voltaire's work. The book tells the story of a young man, Candide, who has been taught by his tutor, Dr. Pangloss, that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and that everything happens for the best. This was a satire of the philosophy of optimism, particularly as expressed by the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz had argued that God, being all-powerful and all-good, must have created the best possible world. Evil and suffering exist, but only because they are necessary to the greater good of the whole. Voltaire found this philosophy to be complacent and absurd, especially in light of real suffering. And so Candide and his companions are subjected to a relentless series of disasters, wars, earthquakes, shipwrecks, betrayals, enslavement, torture. Throughout it all, Pangloss insists that everything is for the best. The book is darkly comic, savage in its satire. It mocks not just philosophical optimism, but also religious hypocrisy, military glory, colonialism, aristocratic pretension. Voltaire spares no one. The tone is light, the pace rapid, but the cumulative effect is devastating. At the end of the tale, Candide and his friends are reunited at a small farm near Constantinople. They are worn out, disillusioned. They encounter a Turkish farmer who lives contentedly, working his land. Inspired by this, Candide concludes that they must cultivate our garden. That is, focus on practical, productive work rather than grand metaphysical speculation. This ending has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as resignation, a retreat from engagement with the world's problems. Others see it as affirmation, that modest, honest work is more valuable than abstract philosophy, that we should focus on what we can actually do to improve our immediate circumstances. In any case, Candide became an instant success and has remained one of the most read works of Enlightenment literature. It captures something essential about Voltaire's worldview, his skepticism about grand systems, his hatred of injustice and cruelty, his belief in practical reason and tolerant skepticism. Voltaire lived until 1778. At the age of 83, he returned to Paris for the first time in nearly 30 years to see his latest play performed. He was greeted like a conquering hero. His carriage was surrounded by crowds. At the theatre, he was crowned with a laurel wreath. The acclaim was overwhelming, but the excitement was too much for his aged constitution. He fell ill and died a few weeks later. The church refused him Christian burial because of his religious views, and his body was hurriedly taken from Paris to be buried at an abbey whose abbot was willing to overlook the rules. But in 1791, during the French Revolution, Voltaire's remains were returned to Paris with great ceremony and entombed in the Pantheon, the resting place of France's heroes. Voltaire's legacy is complex. He was not a systematic philosopher like Locke. He developed no grand theory of politics or ethics. His strength was in critique, in demolishing cant and hypocrisy, in defending the victims of injustice, in making Enlightenment ideas accessible and compelling through his brilliant prose. He stood for reason against superstition, for tolerance against fanaticism, for free inquiry against dogma. He believed that human beings could improve their condition through the application of reason, that progress was possible, that education and honest work were more valuable than inherited privilege or religious mysticism. But the Enlightenment was larger than any one thinker. Across Europe, philosophers, scientists, writers, and reformers were engaged in a collective project to understand the world through reason, to question inherited assumptions, to imagine a better society. This was the age of reason, and its ideas would ultimately help to reshape the political order of Europe and America. Let us now turn to some of these other ideas and to the remarkable community of thinkers who developed and disseminated them. The Enlightenment was not the product of a single mind or even a single nation. It was, rather, a collective intellectual movement that spanned Europe and eventually the Atlantic world. From Edinburgh to Naples, from Boston to Berlin, thinkers engaged with similar questions, read each other's works, corresponded, debated, built upon, and challenged each other's ideas. At the heart of this movement, and clearly, was a set of convictions, not always perfectly consistent with each other, but nonetheless forming a recognizable worldview. First, that reason is the most reliable guide to truth, superior to tradition or revelation. Second, that the natural world operates according to discoverable laws, and that human society might be understood and improved through similar rational inquiry. Third, that human beings possess fundamental rights and dignity. And fourth, that progress is possible, that through the application of reason and the spread of knowledge, the human condition can be improved. As if thinking aloud. These ideas found expression in many forms, in philosophical treatises, in scientific works, in political pamphlets, in novels and plays. But perhaps the most ambitious attempt to gather and systematize Enlightenment knowledge was the Encyclopédie. The Encyclopédie, or Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers, the systematic dictionary of the sciences, arts and crafts, was a massive publishing project that consumed more than 2 decades. It was conceived by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, 2 of the leading philosophes of the French Enlightenment. The project began in the 1740s as a fairly modest proposal to translate an English encyclopedia into French. But under Diderot's editorship, it grew into something far more ambitious, a comprehensive survey of all human knowledge, organized not by tradition, but by rational principles, and written not just for scholars, but for an educated general readership. The first volume appeared in 1751. Eventually, the Encyclopédie would run to 28 volumes, 17 of text and 11 of illustrations, containing more than 70,000 articles written by scores of contributors. Voltaire wrote articles on literature and history. Rousseau contributed articles on music. There were articles on philosophy, mathematics, physics, chemistry, anatomy, agriculture, manufacturing, everything from abstract metaphysics to the practical details of making pins or tanning leather. The Encyclopédie was controversial from the start. Its articles often criticized traditional authority, questioned religious dogma, and promoted Enlightenment values. In 1752, the first 2 volumes were suppressed by the French government. In 1759, the project was officially banned, its printing license revoked. But Diderot persevered. He continued to work on the project in secret, and when the ban was eventually lifted, publication resumed. The completed Encyclopédie was an achievement without precedent, a monument to the Enlightenment faith in reason, in the unity of knowledge, in the power of education to transform society. The Encyclopédie also embodied a particular conception of knowledge that was characteristic of the Enlightenment. Knowledge was not to be the preserve of learned elite, hoarded in monasteries and universities. It was to be made accessible, spread as widely as possible. The more people who possessed knowledge, the better society would become. This faith in education and the spread of knowledge was closely connected to Enlightenment political thought. If human beings are naturally equal, as Locke had argued, and if their ideas and beliefs are shaped by experience and education, as empiricism suggested, then a good society required educated citizens. Ignorance and superstition made people vulnerable to tyranny and fanaticism. Knowledge made them capable of self-government. Another crucial figure in Enlightenment political thought was Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a French nobleman, a president of the Parliament of Bordeaux, and a keen observer of political systems. His masterwork, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, was one of the most influential political works of the 18th century. Montesquieu's aim was to understand the principles underlying different forms of government. He examined republics, monarchies, and despotisms, analyzing the spirit or principle that animated each. For republics, it was virtue. For monarchies, honor. For despotisms, fear. But Montesquieu's most famous and influential idea was the separation of powers. He argued that liberty was best preserved when governmental power was divided among different branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, each with its own sphere of authority and able to check the others. Montesquieu had studied the English Constitution and believed he saw this principle at work there, though his understanding of English government was somewhat idealized. Nonetheless, his theory of the separation of powers would have enormous influence, particularly in America, where the framers of the Constitution would explicitly build it into their design of government. France in the mid-18th century produced many brilliant thinkers, but perhaps the most paradoxical and controversial was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau came from a much humbler background than most philosophers. His mother died when he was an infant. His father, a watchmaker, was unreliable. Jean-Jacques received little formal education and spent his youth wandering, working as an engraver's apprentice, a music teacher, a secretary. Rousseau was largely self-taught, but he possessed a brilliant and original mind. In 1750, he won an essay contest sponsored by the Academy of Dijon. The question was whether the restoration of the sciences and arts had contributed to the purification of morals. Most entrants argued yes, celebrating progress and enlightenment. Rousseau argued no. In his discourse on the sciences and arts, he contended that civilization had corrupted natural human goodness, that the arts and sciences had made people vain, deceitful, and unhappy. Natural man, Rousseau suggested, was solitary, contented, and free. Social man was enslaved by public opinion, by the need for approval, by artificial wants. This was a shocking thesis, seemingly at odds with everything the Enlightenment stood for. And yet Rousseau insisted he was a friend of truth and reason, even if his conclusions differed from those of Voltaire and Diderot. In 1755, Rousseau published another provocative work, The Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. Here he traced the development of human society from its origins to the present, arguing that inequality was not natural, but arose with the development of agriculture and private property. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, thought of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society, Rousseau wrote. From that moment came crimes, wars, murders, miseries, and horrors without number. Rousseau's relationship with other Enlightenment thinkers was complicated. He contributed to the Encyclopédie, writing the article on music. He was friends with Diderot, at least for a time, but he was also suspicious of the salon culture, of the urban sophistication that men like Voltaire embodied. Rousseau preferred nature to the city, simplicity to elegance, feeling to cold reason. In 1762, Rousseau published two of his most important and influential works. The first was Émile, a long treatise on education in the form of a novel. The second was The Social Contract. Émile argues that education should work with the child's natural development, not against it. Children should be allowed to learn from experience, from nature, not forced into rigid academic disciplines before they are ready. The goal is not to produce scholars, but fully developed human beings, capable of thinking for themselves, of moral judgment, of genuine feeling. The social contract is Rousseau's contribution to political philosophy, and it is in some ways quite different from Locke's. Like Locke, Rousseau begins with the state of nature and the idea of a social contract. But Rousseau's version is more radical and, some would argue, more dangerous. For Rousseau, the fundamental problem is how to establish a legitimate political order in which people are genuinely free. His answer is the social contract, but understood in a specific way. When individuals form a political society, they do not simply give up some of their natural rights to a government in exchange for protection. Rather, they merge their individual wills into a general will. This general will is not simply the sum of individual preferences. It is, Rousseau argues, what the community as a whole truly wants, when it seeks the common good rather than private advantage. And when citizens obey the general will, they are obeying themselves. Thus they remain free even while living under law. This is a difficult and subtle idea, and it has been interpreted in many ways. To some, Rousseau's general will represents a vision of participatory democracy, of self-government. To others, it opens the door to totalitarianism, to a tyranny of the majority, or even a tyranny justified by claims to represent the people's true will, even against their expressed preferences. What is certain is that the social contract was profoundly influential. It shaped the ideology of the French Revolution. Robespierre and other revolutionary leaders saw themselves as implementing Rousseau's vision, and debates about the general will, about popular sovereignty, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective self-government. These debates continued long after Rousseau's death in 1778. The Enlightenment was not just about books and ideas, however. It was also about new forms of social organization, new ways of sharing and debating ideas. The salon, for instance, became a characteristic institution of the French Enlightenment. Salons were gatherings, typically held in the home of a wealthy, educated woman, where intellectuals, artists, and members of the aristocracy would meet to converse. The salonières, the women who hosted these gatherings, played a crucial role. They set the tone, guided the conversation, brought together diverse participants. In the salons, ideas could be debated in a relatively informal setting, freed from the rigid hierarchies of court or academy. A talented writer of modest birth might converse on equal terms with a duke. New books and plays were discussed. Reputations were made or broken. The salons helped to create a public sphere, a space of discussion and debate that was neither entirely private nor entirely official. In England and America, coffee houses played a similar role. These establishments, which proliferated in the 17th and 18th centuries, were places where men of different classes could gather, read newspapers and pamphlets, discuss politics and business. They became, in effect, centers of political and economic information exchange. The Enlightenment also saw the rise of new forms of association, Masonic lodges, scientific societies, reading clubs. These voluntary organizations brought together people with shared interests, cutting across traditional social divisions. They embodied the Enlightenment ideal of a community based on reason and shared purpose, rather than inherited status. Newspapers and periodicals proliferated, creating something that historians call the Republic of Letters, a transnational community of scholars and intellectuals who read each other. Others' works corresponded and saw themselves as engaged in a common project of advancing knowledge and reason. This Republic of Letters, with a calm, measured tone, knew no borders. Voltaire corresponded with Frederick of Prussia and Catherine of Russia. Scottish philosophers like David Hume and Adam Smith were widely read in France and Germany. Benjamin Franklin, visiting France as an ambassador from the rebellious American colonies, was celebrated as a philosopher and scientist, the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals. The Enlightenment also produced important work in economics. Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, laid the foundations for modern economics. Smith argued that the wealth of a nation lay not in its accumulation of gold, but in its productive capacity, in the labor of its people. He analyzed how markets coordinate economic activity through what he famously called the invisible hand, how the division of labor increases productivity, how free trade benefits all participants. Smith was no blind advocate of unregulated markets. He recognized that merchants would conspire to fix prices if they could, that monopolies were harmful, that government had important roles to play in providing public goods, enforcing contracts, and protecting the vulnerable. But his work did represent a new way of thinking about economics, analytical, based on observation, and skeptical of traditional restrictions on trade and commerce. In Scotland, the Enlightenment took a distinctive form. Thinkers like Hume, Smith, and Adam Ferguson developed what came to be called moral philosophy, a wide-ranging inquiry into human nature, society, and ethics that drew on history, psychology, and social observation, as well as abstract reasoning. David Hume, in particular, pushed empiricism to its logical conclusion, arguing that even our most basic beliefs about causation and the self cannot be rationally justified, but rest on habit and custom. His skeptical philosophy troubled many of his contemporaries, including some fellow Enlightenment thinkers who felt he had gone too far. But Hume's rigorous analysis set standards for philosophical argument that remain influential today. In Germany, the Enlightenment took yet another form. Immanuel Kant, writing in the 1780s and 1790s, attempted a grand synthesis of rationalism and empiricism, of scientific determinism and human freedom. His critical philosophy analyzed the conditions of knowledge, the foundations of morality, the nature of beauty and teleology. Kant defined enlightenment itself in a famous essay as man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Sapere aude, dare to know, was his motto. Have the courage to use your own understanding without guidance from another. This captures the spirit of the age as well as any phrase could. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideas had spread throughout the Western world. They influenced monarchs who implemented reforms in the name of enlightened absolutism. They inspired revolutionaries who sought to overthrow old regimes and establish new ones based on reason and natural rights. They shaped the development of science, philosophy, economics, political theory, and more. But the Enlightenment was never unchallenged. Even at its height, critics questioned its premises, warned of its dangers, or simply rejected its vision. And as we shall see, the Enlightenment had real blind spots and limitations, ways in which its universalist rhetoric failed to live up to its own ideals. Moreover, the very success of Enlightenment ideas, their role in inspiring revolutions, in challenging traditional authority, would lead to a period of upheaval and violence that would cause many to question whether reason alone was a sufficient guide for human affairs. Let us now turn, in our final section, to the legacy of the Enlightenment, both its achievements and its limits, both the revolutions it inspired and the critiques it provoked. The Enlightenment was, in many ways, a movement of ideas. But ideas, when they take root, can reshape the world. And in the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the limits of government found dramatic expression in two great revolutions, first in America, then in France. The American Revolution, which began in 1775 and led to independence in 1783, was in part a conflict about taxes and representation, about the practical relationship between the American colonies and the British Crown. But it was also a conflict over principles, and those principles were largely Enlightenment principles. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence in 1776, he drew directly on Enlightenment thought, particularly the ideas of John Locke. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," the Declaration proclaims, "that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These are Lockean natural rights, given an American formulation. Jefferson goes on to explain that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that when a government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. This too is Locke's argument from the Second Treatise, now deployed to justify rebellion against the British Crown. The American founders were well read in Enlightenment thought. They knew Locke and Montesquieu, they read Hume and Voltaire, they corresponded with French philosophes. When they gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to draft a constitution for the new nation, they drew on this intellectual heritage. The constitution they produced incorporated Montesquieu's separation of powers, dividing authority among legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It included checks and balances, mechanisms by which each branch could restrain the others. It established a federal system, dividing power between national and state governments. And though it was not perfect, it tolerated slavery, limited voting rights, and left many questions unresolved. It represented an attempt to create a government based on rational design and consent, rather than tradition and force. The American experiment was watched with great interest in Europe, particularly in France. France had supported the American Revolution, partly to weaken Britain, but also because many French intellectuals sympathized with the American cause. When young French aristocrats, like the Marquis de Lafayette, returned from fighting in America, they brought with them ideas about liberty and rights that seemed increasingly relevant to France's own situation. For France in the 1780s was in crisis. The government was essentially bankrupt, having spent enormous sums on wars, including support for the Americans. The system of taxation was wildly inequitable. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt, while the burden fell on commoners. And the political structure offered no way to address these problems. The Estates General, a representative assembly, had not been convened since 1614. In 1789, King Louis XVI, desperate for money, finally called the Estates General. But when it met, conflicts immediately erupted over voting procedures and representation. The Third Estate, representing commoners, declared itself the National Assembly and vowed to write a constitution. The revolution had begun. In its early stages, the French Revolution seemed to embody Enlightenment ideals. On August 26, 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document clearly inspired by both the American Declaration and Enlightenment philosophy. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights, it proclaimed. These rights were liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. The principle of sovereignty resided in the nation. Law was the expression of the general will, a phrase taken directly from Rousseau. Citizens had the right to participate in lawmaking, to speak and write freely, to be secure from arbitrary arrest. It was a remarkable document, a crystallization of Enlightenment political thought, and for a brief moment, it seemed that France might achieve a peaceful transition to constitutional monarchy, as Britain had a century earlier. But the French Revolution did not follow the relatively stable path of the American Revolution. Instead, it radicalized, became more violent, more extreme. The king was arrested trying to flee the country. War broke out with Austria and Prussia. Within France, political factions battled for control. In 1793, Louis XVI was tried and executed. The revolution entered its most radical phase, the Terror, in which thousands were guillotined as enemies of the revolution. The relationship between Enlightenment thought and the Terror has been debated ever since. Did Enlightenment rationalism, pushed to its extreme, lead to this violence? Rousseau's idea of the general will was invoked to justify suppressing dissent. Those who disagreed with the revolutionary government were accused of opposing the people's true will. The cult of reason replaced traditional religion. Abstract principles seemed to override concern for individual human lives. Critics of the Enlightenment, both at the time and since, have argued that this was the inevitable result of rejecting tradition and authority in favor of pure reason, of trying to remake society according to abstract principles rather than allowing it to develop organically. Defenders of the Enlightenment respond that the Terror was a betrayal of Enlightenment values, not their fulfillment. Voltaire had preached tolerance, not terror. Locke had insisted on limited government and individual rights. The violence of the revolution, they argue, came from other sources, from the pressures of war, from social upheaval, from the legacy of absolutism and inequality that the revolution was trying to overcome. Whatever one's judgment on this question, it is clear that the revolution complicated the Enlightenment's legacy. The initial enthusiasm that many intellectuals felt for the revolution turned to horror as the violence escalated. And the association of Enlightenment ideas with revolutionary upheaval made them more controversial, more suspect in the eyes of those who valued order and stability. The Enlightenment also had significant blind spots and limitations that became increasingly apparent over time. Perhaps the most glaring was slavery. How could Enlightenment thinkers proclaim the natural equality of all human beings while tolerating or even defending the enslavement of Africans? Some Enlightenment thinkers did oppose slavery. Montesquieu condemned it. Diderot's Encyclopédie included articles critical of the institution. In the 1780s, anti-slavery societies formed in Britain, France, and America, often drawing on Enlightenment principles to argue for abolition. But many Enlightenment thinkers were complicit in slavery or defended it. Locke invested in the slave trade and helped write the Constitution for the Carolina colony, which explicitly permitted slavery. Jefferson, for all his fine words about equality, owned enslaved people throughout his life. Voltaire profited from colonial ventures. Hume and Kant made explicitly racist statements, suggesting that non-European peoples were inherently inferior. The philosophers generally supported European colonialism, seeing it as a way to spread civilization and enlightenment to supposedly backward peoples. They gave little thought to the violence and exploitation that colonialism involved, or to the voices and perspectives of the colonized themselves. Similarly, the Enlightenment's commitment to equality generally did not extend to women. Most Enlightenment thinkers accepted the subordination of women as natural. Women were excluded from universities, from most professions, from political participation. In the salons, women played an important role, but always within limits, and often their contributions were overlooked or dismissed. There were exceptions. Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, applied Enlightenment principles of reason and natural rights to argue for women's equality. The Marquis de Condorcet, writing at the same time, argued that women should have the same political rights as men. But these were minority voices. Most male philosophers, when they thought about women at all, saw them as different from men in ways that justified their subordination. These limitations were not merely failures to live up to the Enlightenment's ideals. They were, in many cases, built into the very structure of Enlightenment thought. The universal principles of reason and natural rights turned out to be less universal than advertised. The man in Rights of Man was often implicitly understood to mean specifically European men of a certain class. Recognizing these limitations does not mean rejecting the Enlightenment entirely. The ideals of reason, equality, and human rights remain powerful and valuable, even if they were not perfectly realized by those who first articulated them. Indeed, movements for abolition, women's rights, civil rights, and decolonization have often drawn on Enlightenment principles, using them to critique the failures and hypocrisies of Enlightenment thinkers themselves. The Enlightenment also faced philosophical challenges from within Western thought. By the early 19th century, Romanticism emerged as a reaction against what Romantics saw as the cold rationalism of the Enlightenment. Romantic thinkers and artists emphasized emotion over reason, imagination over analysis, the organic over the mechanical. They valued tradition, community, and national culture in ways that seemed at odds with the Enlightenment's cosmopolitan rationalism. They were drawn to the medieval period, to folklore and mythology, to the sublime in nature, all things the Enlightenment had tended to dismiss or devalue. Figures like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge in England, Johann Gottfried Herder and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe in Germany gave voice to a different vision of human existence, one that valued feeling and intuition, that saw human beings as embedded in particular cultures and traditions, not as abstract, rational calculators. The Romantic critique, with a calm, measured tone, was not entirely hostile to the Enlightenment. Many Romantics retained Enlightenment commitments to liberty and progress, but they insisted that reason alone was insufficient, that human beings needed meaning, beauty, belonging, things that cold rationalism could not provide. In the 20th century, the Enlightenment faced more radical critiques. After 2 world wars, after the Holocaust and the Gulag, some thinkers questioned whether the Enlightenment project of rational progress had failed catastrophically. The Frankfurt School thinkers, Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, argued in their Dialectic of Enlightenment that instrumental reason, pushed to its extreme, had culminated in totalitarianism and mass death. Postmodern thinkers questioned the Enlightenment's claims to universal reason and truth, arguing that these claims often masked particular interests and perspectives, that they were used to justify domination and exclude marginalized voices. These critiques, while sometimes overstated, point to real questions. Can reason alone guide human life? Are Enlightenment values truly universal, or are they culturally specific? How do we balance the Enlightenment's emphasis on individual rights with the need for community and solidarity? How do we acknowledge the Enlightenment's genuine achievements while confronting its complicity in oppression? These are questions that remain with us today. We are, in many ways, still living in the long aftermath of the Enlightenment. The political institutions of modern democracies, the methods of modern science, the ideals of human rights and the rule of law all bear the imprint of Enlightenment thought. When we debate about free speech, we are continuing arguments that Voltaire had with the censors of his day. When we discuss the limits of government power, we are revisiting Locke's theories of natural rights and consent. When we struggle with questions of equality and inclusion, we are both drawing on and pushing beyond the Enlightenment's partial vision. The Enlightenment was not a single, unified movement. It was a collection of thinkers across decades and nations, often disagreeing with each other, developing ideas in response to particular contexts and challenges. It was brilliant and it was flawed. It liberated and it excluded. It saw clearly in some directions and was blind in others. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Enlightenment is not any particular set of doctrines, but an attitude, a commitment to subjecting all claims to rational scrutiny, to valuing evidence and argument over authority and tradition, to believing that human beings can understand and improve their world through the exercise of reason. This does not mean blind faith in progress or naive confidence in human rationality. We know now, if we did not before, how fragile civilization is, how reason can be corrupted, how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes. But it means maintaining the conviction that inquiry, debate, and the pursuit of knowledge are worthwhile, that we can learn from experience, correct our errors, and slowly, fitfully, make things better. In that sense, the Enlightenment is not simply a period of history that ended sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. It is an ongoing project, one that each generation must take up anew, informed by past failures and achievements, attentive to voices that were excluded before, but still committed to the ideals of reason, freedom, and human dignity. Locke and Voltaire, Montesquieu and Rousseau, and countless other thinkers of that remarkable era gave us tools for thinking about ourselves and our societies. They did not give us all the answers. They did not even ask all the right questions. But they opened doors. They lit lamps in the darkness. And that light, however flickering and uncertain, continues to guide us. The age of reason may have had its limits, but the commitment to reason itself, properly understood, reason that is humble, that recognizes its own limitations, that is attentive to evidence and open to revision, that serves human flourishing rather than abstract dogma, that commitment remains as necessary now as it was in the salons of 18th century Paris or the coffee houses of London. And so the conversation continues. The questions the Enlightenment raised about freedom and equality, about knowledge and belief, about how we should live together in society, these questions do not have final answers. They must be asked again by each generation in light of new circumstances and new understanding. The Enlightenment taught us to question, to think for ourselves, to dare to know. It taught us that inherited tradition is not always wisdom, that authority must justify itself, that the world can be understood and, perhaps, improved. These lessons, for all the complications and qualifications we must now add to them, remain valuable. As we face the challenges of our own time, questions of justice and equality, of freedom and security, of how to balance individual rights with collective needs, of how to use knowledge wisely, we draw on this heritage. We build on it, we modify it, we sometimes struggle against it, but we cannot escape it. The Enlightenment is part of who we are, for better and for worse. And the task of thinking carefully, questioning deeply, and seeking truth with honesty and humility, that task, which the Enlightenment made central to intellectual life, remains as urgent as ever. For now, though, let these thoughts rest. The ideas of the Enlightenment, the lives of its thinkers, the revolutions they inspired, all of this has been a long journey through history and philosophy. It is complex, sometimes troubling, but always fascinating, always illuminating. The work of understanding continues, but for tonight at least, it is enough to have glimpsed these remarkable minds at work, to have followed their arguments and seen their world. The conversation they began continues, and you are part of it, whether you realize it or not. And so, as the philosophers of the Enlightenment might say, the inquiry remains open. The questions persist. The search for understanding goes on. For now, rest well.